At exactly 8:17 p.m. on Christmas Eve, my older brother slammed my head into the edge of our mother's dining table, while my father, calmly, asked if anyone wanted more gravy. I remember the sound first, not the pain, the sound of porcelain rattling, the crystal glasses chiming like tiny bells, my daughter Lily's fork dropping onto her plate, and my mother, Patricia Ann Whitmore, sighing not in shock, not in concern, but in irritation, as if I had spilled wine on her white tablecloth instead of bleeding onto it. If you've ever been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you, you already know this kind of silence. And if you haven't, stay with me, because what happened after that night didn't just change my life. It destroyed theirs. So if you believe karma comes slowly but always arrives, consider subscribing and listening closely, because this story is not about revenge born from rage. It's about revenge built from patience, and patience is much more dangerous. My name is Elena Grace Whitmore. I was 32 years old that Christmas, a single mother, a licensed respiratory therapist, working night shifts at St. Mary's Medical Center in Des Moines, Iowa. I made $67,000 a year. Enough to survive, never enough to feel safe, especially not when you were raising a 5-year-old alone. Lily Rose Whitmore was born premature. Her lungs were fragile from the beginning. Medical bills followed us like shadows that never disappeared. But I never asked my family for help. Not once, until that night. The Whitmore house sat on Maple Ridge Drive, a quiet suburban street lined with identical 2-story homes that all smelled faintly of pine and wealth. My parents had bought their house in 1998 for $212,000. By 2023, it was worth nearly $540,000. Paid off for years. No mortgage, no financial stress, just pride and control. My father, Daniel Robert Whitmore, was a retired insurance adjuster, a man who believed that helping someone financially made them weak. My mother, Patricia, believed something worse. She believed love had to be earned through obedience. And then there was my older brother, Kevin Michael Whitmore, 38, unemployed for the 3rd time in 6 years, living in our parents' basement, still treated like the golden child, still called the one who carries the family name. I was the opposite, the disappointment, the one who chose a difficult life, because I had left home at 19, because I refused to marry the man my parents approved, because I had a child without their permission. Yes, that's the exact phrase my mother once used. Without permission. That Christmas Eve, I arrived at 6:42 p.m. with Lily holding my hand. The house smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon candles. From the outside, everything looked perfect. From the inside, nothing ever was. Kevin didn't even stand up when we walked in. He just glanced at me from the couch and smirked. Well, he said, "Look, who finally came crawling back." I smiled politely, because survival teaches you something important. You don't show teeth unless you're ready to bite. Dinner started normally. My father carving turkey with military precision. My mother correcting Lily's posture. Kevin making jokes that weren't really jokes. And me, waiting, counting the right moment. Because I hadn't come for celebration. I had come for a request that terrified me. At 7:58 p.m., I finally said it. I remember checking the clock first, because part of me knew this moment would change everything. "Mom," I said quietly, "I need to ask you something important." She didn't look at me. "Make it quick," she replied. "I'm trying to keep the gravy warm." I swallowed. "The bank approved my mortgage for the townhouse," I said, "but the closing costs are higher than expected. I'm short about $50,000. Silence fell over the table. Kevin snorted. My father stopped carving. My mother slowly placed her fork down, and then she looked at me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You came here," she said, "on Christmas, to ask us for money." I tried to keep my voice steady. It wouldn't be a gift. I'd sign a legal repayment agreement, interest included. I just need time. Kevin laughed loudly. A repayment agreement? With what income? Your hospital job barely pays your bills. I ignored him. I kept looking at my mother because I still believe stupidly that somewhere inside her there was a mother. I was wrong. Her voice turned cold. Do you know why we never helped you, Elena? She asked. I shook my head. Because helping you would validate your bad decisions. Each word landed like a slap. You chose to leave, she continued. You chose to raise a child alone. You chose to struggle. She leaned closer. So struggle. I should have stopped there. I should have stood up. I should have left. But desperation does something to dignity. It makes you believe one more sentence might fix everything. So I said the worst possible thing. You helped Kevin, I whispered. The room froze. Kevin's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. Don't compare yourself to me, he snapped. You gave him $80,000 last year, I said, my voice trembling now. You paid off his debts. My father slammed his knife onto the table. That was different, he said sharply. How I asked. Kevin's face darkened, and that was the moment everything exploded. He walked around the table slowly, too calmly. That was always the warning sign. He stopped behind my chair. I felt his hand grip my shoulder. Hard. You don't get it, he whispered near my ear. You're not family anymore. And then he shoved my head forward, straight into the table's wooden edge. The pain burst white behind my eyes. Lily screamed. My mother shouted Kevin, but not in horror, in annoyance, like someone scolding a dog for knocking over a chair. And my father, he didn't move at all. He just said calmly, sit down. Don't make a scene. That was the moment something inside me changed forever. Not when I tasted blood. Not when my ribs ached with each breath. But when I realized this truth, they weren't angry at me for asking for help. They were angry because I had dared to remind them that they owed me fairness, and fairness threatened their control. I pressed a napkin against my bleeding lip, slowly stood, took Lily's shaking hand, and walked toward the door without saying another word. Behind me, I heard my mother say something that would echo in my mind for months. See, she said, this is why we never include her in anything. I didn't know it then, but as I drove away into the icy December night, my father was already making a phone call, and in that call, he mentioned a document, a legal document I had never heard of, a document that would prove something horrifying, something that would take me 2 years to uncover. And when I finally did, it would destroy the Whitmore family forever. But tell me this before we go further. If you were in my place that night, bleeding, humiliated, holding your child's hand, would you have walked away quietly like I did? Or would you have turned back and fought immediately? Because at that moment, I chose silence. And that silence became the most dangerous weapon I ever held. By 9:03 p.m., I was sitting in my car outside an urgent care clinic with a paper towel pressed against my mouth, trying to stop the bleeding, before Lily noticed how badly my hands were shaking. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because crying would have meant accepting something I wasn't ready to accept yet, that my family had crossed a line they would never come back from. Lily sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her small, stuffed rabbit Rosie. She didn't ask questions right away. She just watched me. Children always know more than we think. After a few minutes, she whispered, Mommy, are we in trouble? That question cut deeper than Kevin's shove. No, I said softly. We're not in trouble. She hesitated. Then why did Uncle Kevin hurt you? I closed my eyes for one long second. Because how do you explain betrayal to a 5-year-old? How do you explain that sometimes the people who share your blood don't share your heart? I turned to face her. Sometimes, I said carefully, people don't know how to handle their own anger. And when they feel weak, they try to make others feel smaller. She thought about that. Then she nodded slowly. Like bullies at school. Yes, I said. Exactly like bullies. At 9:27 p.m., a nurse confirmed what I already suspected. 2 bruised ribs, a split lip that needed 3 stitches. No concussion, no internal bleeding. Do you want to file a report? She asked gently. Her tone told me she had seen this situation many times before. Domestic violence, family assault, stories that started with, "It's complicated." I stared at the sterile white wall, and for a moment, I almost said yes, because legally, what Kevin did was assault. Clear, simple, prosecutable. But then I imagined the consequences. Police reports, court dates, family backlash, my parents turning the story against me, and Lily being dragged into a legal war she didn't deserve. So I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "It was an accident." The nurse didn't argue, but she gave me a look I would later understand perfectly. A look that said, "You're protecting the wrong people." We left the clinic just before midnight. Snow had started falling, thick, heavy flakes that covered everything in deceptive softness. The world looked peaceful, clean, untouched, but inside my chest, something had cracked open permanently. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. Once, twice, then repeatedly. I didn't need to look to know who it was, but I looked anyway. Mom Patricia Whitmore, 5 missed calls. Then a message. "You embarrassed us tonight. Don't come back until you can be respectful." I stared at the words for a long time, not because they hurt, but because they didn't surprise me. Kevin's name popped up next. One text. "Next time you compare yourself to me, I won't stop at a shove." I blocked his number immediately. No hesitation, no regret. That was the first boundary I ever set with my family, and it would not be the last. When we got home, Lily fell asleep almost instantly. Children have that gift. They can escape pain through sleep. Adults carry it into the night. I sat alone at our small kitchen table, staring at a stack of documents spread before me. Mortgage papers, bank statements, closing cost estimates, numbers that felt heavier than they should. The townhouse I was trying to buy wasn't luxurious. It was a modest 2-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood near Lily's school. Price $238,000. My down payment had taken 7 years of saving, 7 years of skipped vacations, second shifts, selling my old car, skipping meals sometimes. I was so close, so painfully close. But closing costs, inspection fees, and escrow requirements had created a $50,000 gap I hadn't anticipated. Without that money, I would lose the deal, and with it, the first stable home Lily had ever known. At 1:14 a.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my father. He never called late at night. Never. I hesitated before answering. "Hello." His voice was calm, too calm. "You should not have asked for money tonight," he said. No concern, no apology, just accusation. "I needed help," I replied quietly. "You needed discipline," he corrected. Silence stretched between us. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Stop worrying about a house you'll never own," he continued. "You're not in the will anyway." The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. "What?" He exhaled slowly. "As of last year, he said your mother and I updated our estate plan. Everything goes to Kevin." I couldn't speak. Not because I expected money. I never did. But because of what that decision represented. Total erasure. "You removed me completely," I whispered. "You removed yourself," he replied. And then he hung up. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table until dawn, staring at nothing, trying to understand how a family could decide one child simply no longer existed, trying to understand what I had done that deserved complete exclusion, and most of all, trying to understand why he sounded so certain, so confident, as if the will wasn't the only document involved. 2 days later, something strange happened. A letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address, just my name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It appeared to be a legal document header, typed in formal language, stamped by a law office in Des Moines. And then I saw the title, Property Transfer Authorization Agreement, Whitmore Family Residence. My hands started shaking. Because beneath that title was a date, December 3rd, 3 weeks before Christmas. And at the bottom, there were 2 signatures, my father's and my brother Kevin's. But there was something else, something that made no sense at all. A third line, a signature line labeled Witness and Beneficiary. Consent, Elena Grace Whitmore. And next to it, a signature that looked exactly like mine, except I had never signed anything. I stared at that name for a long time. On a document I had never seen, on a transaction I had never agreed to, on something that clearly involved my parents' house. And in that moment, one terrifying question formed in my mind. What exactly had they used my identity for, without my knowledge? Because this wasn't just about being excluded from a will anymore. This was something else, something far more dangerous and far more illegal. If you had just discovered your own signature on a legal document you never signed, what would you do first? Would you confront them immediately? Or stay silent and start digging for the truth? Because this time, I didn't choose silence out of fear. I chose it for a very different reason. I chose it because I was ready to learn how deep their betrayal really went. At 7:12 a.m., the morning after I found the document, I was sitting in my car outside the Polk County Recorder's office with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I hadn't slept, not even for a minute, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that signature. My name, written in ink, attached to something I had never agreed to. And the worst part wasn't the forgery itself. It was what it implied. They hadn't just excluded me from their lives. They had used me, legally, strategically, like I was a tool instead of a daughter. The Polk County building opened at 8:00 a.m. I walked in at 7:59. I didn't want to give myself time to second-guess this, because part of me still wanted to believe there was some mistake, some explanation, some logical misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a betrayal that had been planned. The clerk who helped me introduced herself as Marissa Lopez. She was in her 40s, calm professional, with the kind of eyes that notice details without judgment. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I slid the photocopy across the counter. "I need to know if this document is real," I said. She adjusted her glasses and studied it carefully. Then she typed something into her computer. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, she looked back at me. "Yes," she said. "This is a recorded property transfer authorization." My stomach dropped. "So it's official." "Yes." She turned her screen slightly so I could see. "This document was filed on December 5th, she explained. "It authorizes the transfer of the Whitmore residence into a joint ownership structure." Joint ownership. Between who? She hesitated. Then read directly from the record. Daniel Robert Whitmore and Kevin Michael Whitmore. "My father and my brother." I swallowed hard. "Where do I come into this?" Marissa pointed at the witness section. "You're listed here as a consenting party," she said. "Why would they need my consent?" I asked. Her expression changed slightly. Not suspicious. Concerned. "Because," she said carefully, "the record indicates that at one time you were listed as a contingent beneficiary on a previous trust associated with the property. The room felt suddenly too small, so they needed me to sign off to remove that." "Yes, and without that consent, the transfer could have been challenged later." Silence pressed in around me. Every sound in the office felt distant, muted, because in that moment, everything became clear. They didn't just remove me from their will. They had rushed to transfer their biggest asset, their house, into Kevin's control, and they needed my signature to make sure I could never contest it. But they didn't ask for it. They didn't even tell me. They forged it. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "Do you verify signatures when documents are filed?" Marissa shook her head gently. "No, we record what is submitted. Verification is handled by notaries." My pulse quickened. "Was this notarized?" She scrolled again. "Yes." Then she read the name. Notary Public Andrew Collins. That name hit me like a sudden gust of cold air, because I knew exactly who that was. Andrew Collins wasn't a random notary. He was Kevin's best friend from high school, and currently, he worked at a small law office downtown. In that instant, the truth landed fully. This wasn't just family betrayal anymore. This was fraud. Document fraud, identity misuse, potentially a felony, and they had done it confidently, as if they believed I would never find out or never fight back. Marissa must have seen the realization on my face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I nodded automatically, but inside, something fundamental was shifting. For years, I had accepted my family's cruelty as emotional, psychological, personal. Now, I understood something much darker. Their actions were not impulsive. They were calculated, planned, legalistic. They didn't just want to hurt me. They wanted to erase me permanently. I thanked Marissa and left the office. The winter air hit my lungs sharply. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the gray sky, trying to steady my breathing, because this was the moment where most people would react emotionally. They would call, they would confront, they would demand explanations. But I didn't, because something inside me had become very, very clear. If I confronted them now, they would deny everything. They would hide evidence. They would tighten their control. And I would lose the only advantage I had: time. So instead of calling my parents, I did something else. I drove to the hospital, worked my full shift, smiled at patients, helped people breathe, while inside my mind, a completely different kind of survival plan was forming. At 3:46 p.m. during my break, I pulled out my phone and searched one thing: identity fraud statute, Iowa penalty. The answer appeared quickly. Under Iowa law, forgery involving property transactions could carry felony charges, up to 10 years in prison, and significant financial penalties. I stared at those numbers, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a strange, steady calm. Because for the first time in my life, the power dynamic between me and my family had shifted. They thought they had secured everything, but in reality, they had just handed me leverage. That evening, when I picked up Lily from daycare, she ran into my arms like she always did. "Did you have a good day, Mommy?" she asked. I hugged her tightly. "Yes," I said. "I think I finally understand something important." "What?" I smiled softly. "That sometimes," I said, "when people try to push you out, they accidentally show you exactly where their weak spots are." She didn't fully understand, but she smiled anyway, because children trust tone more than words. That night, after Lily fell asleep, I took out a notebook, and for the first time, I wrote a list, not of grievances, not of memories, but of facts, dates, names, legal connections, financial details, evidence, because revenge, driven by emotion, burns fast and dies quickly. But revenge, built on truth, is patient, precise, and unstoppable. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you discovered your own family had forged your identity to protect their wealth, would you expose them immediately? Or would you wait, gather everything, and make sure that when the truth came out, it couldn't be denied? Because at that moment, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I chose not to fight them in anger. I chose to fight them in silence. And they had no idea that the quiet daughter they thought they erased had just become the most dangerous witness they would ever face. What I didn't know yet was that the forged signature wasn't the worst part. Not even close, because buried deep inside the legal paperwork, there was another clause, a hidden one, a clause that tied my name to something far more devastating than property, something that would put my financial future and my daughter's stability at serious risk, and it would take me months to discover it. At exactly 11:38 p.m., 3 nights after discovering the forged signature, I found the clause that made my hands go numb. It was only 2 sentences long, buried on page 7 of a supplemental filing attached to the property transfer record. 2 sentences that could have destroyed my financial life for the next 20 years. I hadn't planned to look that night. I was supposed to be sleeping. My shift at St. Mary's started at 6:00 a.m., and Lily had a school presentation in the morning. But something inside me refused to rest. Because the more I thought about it, the more one question kept circling my mind. Why would they risk committing a felony just to transfer a house they already owned? There had to be another reason. And when a question like that refuses to leave you alone, it usually means your instincts already know the answer. So I logged into the Polk County Public Records portal. I searched under my father's name, then Kevin's, then the property address. That's when I noticed something strange. There wasn't just one filing. There were multiple documents submitted on the same day. Most were standard transfer forms, but one caught my eye. It was labeled Supplemental Liability, Acknowledgement Co-signing Party. My stomach tightened because the term co-signing party shouldn't have had anything to do with me. Not unless my hand shook slightly as I opened the PDF. At first, it looked like dense legal language, paragraphs full of words designed to sound harmless. But I had learned something during my years handling hospital billing disputes. Legal documents don't hide danger in bold letters. They hide it in small technical phrasing. And then I saw it near the bottom, under a section titled Financial Responsibility Clause. It read, "The undersigned acknowledges joint liability for any outstanding loans, liens, or financial obligations secured against the Whitmore family residence, including, but not limited, to refinancing debts, secondary mortgages, or equity withdrawal instruments executed prior to this transfer." Below it was my forged signature. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe, because that sentence meant something very specific, something very real. They hadn't just used my name to remove me from future ownership claims. They had used my name to attach me to their debt. My father and Kevin had taken out loans against the house, and now, on paper, I was legally responsible for paying them if they defaulted. I stared at the screen in disbelief, trying to process how calculated this was, because it wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. If Kevin failed to repay whatever debt he had taken on, creditors could come after me, my wages, my savings, my ability to qualify for a mortgage, everything. All without my knowledge, all without my consent. And suddenly, a chilling realization settled in. That Christmas Eve, when I asked for $50,000 to close on my townhouse, they already knew something I didn't. They knew I might never be able to buy a home at all. Because legally, they had already tied my financial future to their risk. My phone buzzed beside me, pulling me back to reality. It was a notification from my banking app. I opened it automatically and froze because my credit monitoring service had sent an alert. New inquiry detected commercial lending institution. The date, 2 weeks earlier. I hadn't applied for anything. I hadn't authorized any checks. Yet someone had accessed my credit profile. My heart started pounding because now the pattern was undeniable. They weren't just forging documents. They were actively using my identity, and that crossed an even more serious legal line. Identity theft, financial fraud, criminal territory that went far beyond family conflict. I sat there, in the dark kitchen, staring at the screen, trying to steady my thoughts, because anger was rising now. Sharp, hot, dangerous, but beneath it, there was something colder, clarity. For years, I had thought my family's cruelty came from emotion, from favoritism, from resentment. Now, I understood the truth. This wasn't emotional. It was transactional. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as an asset they could exploit. And then another thought struck me, a question that made my stomach twist. What if they had done this before? What if this wasn't the first time they had used my identity? What if there were other accounts, other loans, other obligations, still hidden? At that moment, I had a choice. I could call them immediately, demand explanations, threaten legal action, or I could do something much more dangerous, stay silent, and let them continue believing I knew nothing. Because if they thought I was unaware, they would keep moving, Keep signing. Keep leaving evidence. I closed the laptop slowly, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, I allowed myself to whisper something out loud. Not in anger, not in pain, but in cold certainty. They just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The next morning, I did something very deliberate. I called a lawyer, not a family attorney, not someone who handled divorces or wills. I searched specifically for financial fraud and identity theft attorney Des Moines. That's how I found Margaret Elaine Foster. She had been practicing for 25 years. Former federal prosecutor, known for handling complex fraud cases. Her reviews described her with one word, repeated over and over: relentless. When I met her that afternoon, she didn't waste time on small talk. She listened silently as I explained everything. The assault, the forged signature, the property transfer, the liability clause, the credit inquiry. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said something that changed everything. "This is not just family misconduct," she said calmly. "This is a coordinated financial fraud scheme." My chest tightened. "How serious is it?" She looked directly at me. "Serious enough." She said that if proven, it could result in felony charges, civil liability, and potentially the forced reversal of all associated property transfers. The words felt heavy, but also strangely stabilizing, because for the first time, I had confirmation that I wasn't imagining the severity of what they had done. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't being emotional. I was dealing with a legal reality. Margaret folded her hands on the desk. "But before we move forward," she said, "you need to answer one critical question." I nodded. "What do you want from this?" "Justice," I said immediately. She shook her head slightly. "That's not specific enough." Her gaze sharpened. "Do you want criminal charges, financial restitution, property rights, protection from liability, public exposure, or all of the above?" I opened my mouth, then stopped, because I realized something important. I hadn't actually decided yet. Not fully, and the choice I made now would determine the entire direction of what came next. "So let me ask you something. If your own family had secretly tied your financial future to their debt, would you aim only to protect yourself, or would you go further and make sure they faced consequences they could never escape?" Because in that quiet office, looking at the lawyers across from me, I was about to make a decision, one that would set everything in motion. And once I made it, there would be no turning back. What I didn't know yet was that my father and Kevin were already in deeper financial trouble than I could imagine. And in less than 3 months, their desperation would push them into a mistake so reckless. It would give me the final piece of evidence I needed to bring everything crashing down. At 2:06 p.m. on a freezing Thursday in late January, Margaret Foster slid a thin manila folder across her desk and said 6 words that changed everything. "They're drowning in debt, Elena. Not struggling, not managing, drowning." I opened the folder slowly, my fingers steady, even though my pulse wasn't. Inside were public financial records Margaret's office had pulled legally: loan filings, lien notices, refinancing documents, credit disclosures tied to the Whitmore residence. The numbers didn't just surprise me, they shocked me, because the house my parents had bragged about being fully paid off was now carrying more than $318,000 in debt. I stared at the breakdown. 2019, home equity line of credit, $120,000. 2021, secondary refinance loan, $85,000. 2022, personal business collateral loan under Kevin's name, $113,000. All secured against the same property. The same house they had refused to help me from. The same house they had used to control me emotionally for years, now leveraged almost to its full value. I looked up at Margaret. What did they do with the money? She tapped one page. "Most of it traces back to Kevin," she said. "Failed investments, gambling debts, and what appears to be a short-lived trucking business that never became profitable. I felt something cold settle inside me because suddenly, Kevin's anger that Christmas made perfect sense. He wasn't just protecting his ego. He was protecting the only asset keeping him afloat. If I had remained a beneficiary, if I had legal standing, I could have challenged those loans later. So they eliminated me and then used my identity to make sure I shared the risk. Margaret leaned forward slightly. There's more, she said. She flipped to another page. This loan here, she continued, pointing to the 2022 filing, was already flagged internally by the lender. Flagged for high default risk. My stomach tightened. How soon could they default? She didn't hesitate. Based on payment history, possibly within 6 to 9 months. Silence filled the room because the implications were immediate and terrifying. If they defaulted, creditors could legally pursue anyone listed as financially responsible, including me, even though I had never agreed, even though my signature was forged. Because until fraud was legally proven, the liability remained active. That was when I asked the question that had been building inside me. If I do nothing right now, what happens? Margaret's answer was calm and precise. If they default before we act, she said, creditors could file claims against you. Your wages could be garnished, your credit destroyed, your ability to secure your own mortgage eliminated. My chest felt tight because suddenly, this wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even just about justice. It was about survival. My survival, Lily's stability, our future. Margaret watched me carefully. You need to understand something, she said. They didn't just betray you emotionally. They positioned you as a financial shield. A shield. Yes, she replied. If Kevin fails, they wanted someone else to absorb the fallout. The words hit with brutal clarity. They hadn't just erased me. They had turned me into insurance. For a moment, anger surged inside me. Sharp and hot, but it didn't explode. It condensed, focused. Because rage alone wouldn't fix this. Strategy would. Margaret spoke again. There are 2 paths forward, she said. First, we act immediately. File fraud claims, initiate civil litigation, potentially trigger criminal investigation. She paused. Second, we wait. I looked at her. Wait for what? For them to make a larger, irreversible mistake, she said quietly. Fraud cases become significantly stronger when there's a clear financial loss or attempted exploitation. I understood instantly. If we move now, we could stop the fraud. But if we waited, we could expose everything, fully, irrefutably. Before I could answer, Margaret added something else. There's also a timing factor, she said. What do you mean? She opened another file and slid a printed notice toward me. Kevin Whitmore filed paperwork last week, she said, for a personal bankruptcy consultation. I stared at the document because if Kevin declared bankruptcy, everything connected to his debts would be scrutinized, including property transfers, co-signers, liability structures. Forgery could surface naturally without me initiating it. The realization sent a strange chill through me because suddenly the power dynamic had shifted even further. They thought they had secured everything. But in reality, they were walking toward exposure on their own. Margaret folded her hands again. So I'll ask you once more, she said. What outcome do you want? I didn't answer immediately. Because now, the decision wasn't simple. It wasn't just about punishing them. It was about timing, precision, choosing the moment that would cause the most undeniable consequences. That night, after I tucked Lily into bed, she asked me something unexpected. Mommy, she said softly, are we going to move to the new house? The question pierced me because she had drawn pictures of that townhouse, imagined her bedroom, her little garden, her safe place. I sat beside her and brushed her hair gently. I'm going to make sure we have a home, I said, no matter what. She smiled sleepily. I know you will, she whispered, because you always fix things. After she fell asleep, I sat in the quiet living room, thinking about everything, the debt, the forgery, the risk, and one truth became undeniable. This wasn't just about stopping them. It was about making sure they could never do this to me or anyone ever again. Let me ask you something. If you knew your family was already heading toward financial collapse, would you stop them early to protect yourself? Or would you wait, let their own choices expose them completely, and ensure the consequences were permanent? Because that night, I made a decision, one that required patience, one that required control, one that would turn their entire strategy against them. I chose to wait, but not passively, not helplessly. I chose to prepare, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family anymore. I was anticipating them, and they had no idea that every step they took toward survival was leading them straight into a trap they built themselves. What I didn't know yet was that in just 6 weeks, Kevin would do something reckless enough to create a public moment, a moment so explosive it would become the perfect stage for the truth to finally come out. At exactly 6:52 p.m. on a Saturday in early March, my brother Kevin Whitmore stood in a rented banquet hall, raising a champagne glass, smiling like a man who believed his future had just been secured. What he didn't know was that he had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy his carefully built illusion. I wasn't supposed to be there. In fact, Kevin had spent years making sure I was never invited to anything important. Family birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, business gatherings, even casual barbecues. But this event was different because it wasn't a family celebration. It was a public one, a networking investment launch party for his newest venture. And public events have one weakness Kevin never understood. They leave witnesses. 2 weeks earlier, Margaret had called me with an update. Kevin secured private investors, she said. For what? A logistics startup, she replied. He's pitching it as a regional trucking coordination platform. I felt a cold familiarity settle in, because this pattern wasn't new. Kevin had chased schemes for years, always chasing fast money, always avoiding real work. But this time was different. This time, he was using the Whitmore house as collateral. Again, Margaret explained the risk calmly. If he defaults on investor guarantees, she said they will pursue all listed responsible parties. All I repeated. Yes, she said, and based on the supplemental liability clause, you could be pulled into those claims, unless we establish fraud. That was the moment I realized something critical. Kevin wasn't slowing down. He was escalating, desperately. And desperate people make careless mistakes. So when Margaret suggested we monitor the situation instead of intervening immediately, I understood why. Because if Kevin publicly tied my name to anything financial, the fraud case would become undeniable. 3 days later, I received an unexpected message. Not from Kevin, not from my parents, but from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Hi, Elena. This is Jason Patel. I'm attending Kevin's investor event next week. Your name came up in a conversation, and I think you should know. Jason Patel had gone to high school with Kevin. Unlike Kevin, he had built a real career. Now, he worked as a venture risk analyst for a regional investment group. He wasn't someone who contacted people casually, so I called him immediately. Kevin mentioned you during his investor briefing, Jason said bluntly. In what way? He listed you as a financial co-guarantor, Jason replied. The words hit like a physical blow. He what? Jason continued carefully. He said, you're a licensed healthcare professional with stable income, and that you co-signed liability on the family property tied to his business funding. My vision blurred for a moment, because this wasn't just forgery anymore. This was active misrepresentation to investors, and that crossed into another serious legal territory. Financial fraud with third-party damages. Jason's voice softened slightly. I didn't believe it, he said. So I checked the filings. Your name is there. I closed my eyes. Of course it was. Kevin wasn't just using my identity quietly. He was leveraging it publicly to gain trust, to attract money, to keep his failing world afloat. Jason hesitated. There's an investor event Saturday night, he said. If you want to understand exactly how he's presenting this, you should see it yourself. That's how I ended up standing in the back of a banquet hall on March 4th, at 6:52 p.m., watching my brother speak confidently to a room full of strangers. Kevin looked polished. Expensive suit, new watch, hair styled perfectly. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked successful, reliable, trustworthy. But I knew the truth beneath that image. The unpaid debts, the forged signatures, the desperation hidden under his confidence. He clicked through a presentation on a large screen. Charts, revenue projections, growth timelines, all designed to impress. But then he reached a slide titled Security and Financial Stability. My heart began to pound, because beneath that title was a bullet point that made the entire room feel suddenly smaller. Family-backed collateral structure, ensuring multi-party financial accountability. And below that, 3 names appeared: Daniel Whitmore, Kevin Whitmore, and Elena Whitmore. A murmur of approval moved through the audience. Investors nodded. Some even smiled, because from their perspective, multiple responsible parties meant reduced risk. It meant stability. It meant safety. They had no idea one of those names was there illegally. Kevin raised his glass. "As you can see," he said confidently, "our family has fully committed to this venture. We're all financially tied to its success." The words echoed in my ears, because they weren't just lies. They were calculated lies, designed to make investors trust him. In that moment, I felt something unexpected. Not rage, not pain, but clarity. Because Kevin had just done something incredibly reckless. He had tied my forged identity to public financial solicitation. And he had done it in front of dozens of witnesses, with documentation, with recorded presentations, with proof. And legally, that changed everything. Because fraud, involving third-party investors, carried far more severe consequences than private document forgery. It meant civil liability, potential criminal charges, and financial penalties that could destroy him completely. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reveal myself. I simply watched, memorized, collected details. Because the most powerful moment in any confrontation is not when you feel angry. It's when you know you already hold all the evidence. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you discovered your own brother was publicly using your identity to secure money, would you expose him immediately in front of everyone? Or would you wait, let him dig deeper, and make sure the consequences became irreversible? Because that night, as I walked out quietly into the cold March air, I knew something with absolute certainty. Kevin had just crossed a line he could never step back from. What I didn't know yet was that only a few weeks later, he would take one final desperate step. A step so reckless, it would force the truth into the open at the worst possible moment for him and the best possible moment for me. At 9:41 p.m., the night of Kevin's investor party, I sat alone in my car in the dark parking lot and did something that would have terrified the old version of me. I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I didn't even feel angry. I simply turned off my phone because for the first time in my life, I understood something powerful. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. And the quieter I became, the louder his mistakes would echo. The drive home felt unreal. Streetlights passed in steady rhythms, reflecting off melting patches of snow. Everything looked normal, peaceful. But inside my mind, something had shifted permanently. For years, I had reacted to my family's cruelty emotionally, trying to explain, trying to justify, trying to be heard. Now, I wasn't reacting at all. I was observing, calculating, waiting, and that change alone made me more dangerous than they could ever imagine. When I got home, Lily was already asleep. Her nightlight cast a soft glow across her small room. I stood there for a long time, just watching her breathe, because everything I was doing, every decision, every risk, came down to one truth. I wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. I was fighting for stability, for safety, for a future where no one could ever threaten her security again. The next morning, I met Margaret Foster again. She didn't need me to explain much. I simply handed her a USB drive Jason had given me. Inside was a recording of Kevin's presentation, including the slide with my name. Margaret watched it silently. Then she paused the video. Right on the frame, showing the 3 names. She leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I met her, I saw something close to satisfaction in her expression. This, she said, calmly, changes the entire case. I folded my hands tightly. How? She turned the monitor slightly toward me. Before she explained, we had forgery and identity misuse. Serious, but largely private matters. She tapped the screen. Now we have documented financial misrepresentation to third parties. That elevates this into potential criminal fraud territory. My heartbeat slowed, not from relief, but from clarity, because the path forward had just become unmistakable. Margaret continued, if investors rely on false financial guarantees and suffer losses, prosecutors can pursue charges much more aggressively. She paused, and based on his current debt trajectory, losses are almost inevitable. The words landed heavily, because Kevin wasn't just risking his own future anymore. He was putting dozens of strangers at risk too. People who believed him, trusted him, invested because of promises tied to my name. I looked at Margaret. So what do we do now? She held my gaze steadily. We wait. The word felt heavy, but not surprising, because patience had already become my strongest weapon. She explained further. Right now, Kevin still appears solvent, she said. If we act immediately, he may claim this was a misunderstanding. But if he defaults, then the damages become real, she finished. And real damages make fraud undeniable. That afternoon, I made another quiet decision. I froze my credit completely, placed fraud alerts with all 3 major reporting agencies, opened a new bank account, separated every financial connection that could possibly be exploited. Because while I waited, I wasn't passive. I was fortifying, protecting, preparing. Days passed, then weeks, and something strange began to happen. Kevin tried to contact me, repeatedly. At first, it was text messages. Hey, need to talk. Then, more aggressive ones. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Then voicemails, his voice shifting from irritated to anxious to something close to desperation. One voicemail, left at 11:16 p.m., stayed with me. Elena, just call me back, okay? We need to discuss some paperwork updates. It's not a big deal. His tone wasn't angry anymore. It was nervous. And that told me everything I needed to know, because Kevin never got nervous unless he was losing control. My mother tried too. Her messages were colder. You are causing unnecessary problems by refusing to communicate. Families resolve things privately. You owe us cooperation after everything we've done for you. I didn't respond, not once, because engaging emotionally would give them what they needed. Time to adjust, time to cover tracks, time to manipulate. And I wasn't giving them any of that. Weeks of silence did something unexpected. It shifted the power dynamic completely. For the first time in our lives, they didn't know what I was thinking. They didn't know what I knew. And that uncertainty terrified them more than any argument ever could. Let me ask you something. If you knew your silence was making the people who hurt you panic, would you break it to confront them? Or would you stay quiet and let their fear grow until they made a fatal mistake? Because silence, when used correctly, isn't passive. It's pressure. And pressure makes people crack. By mid-April, the cracks began to show. Margaret called me one afternoon, her voice calm but sharper than usual. Kevin missed 2 loan payments, she said, both tied to the property-backed financing. My stomach tightened. What happens next? She didn't hesitate. Default notices are likely within 30 days. That meant something critical. If he couldn't recover quickly, creditors would start investigating the collateral structure, which meant they would see my name. And once they contacted me, the fraud would surface automatically. Kevin must have known this too, because just 3 days later, he made a decision so reckless, so desperate, that it would push everything toward an unavoidable confrontation. At 8:02 p.m. on a rainy Thursday night, My phone rang from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. A calm, male voice spoke. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, this is Robert Gaines from Prairie State Lending. We need to discuss your co-signed financial liability on the Whitmore property loan." My heart slowed to an eerie calm, because the moment had finally arrived. The moment where the truth could no longer stay hidden. Before we continue, think about this. If a bank called you about a debt you never agreed to, would you panic, or would you finally feel ready? Because you had been waiting for this exact moment all along. Because when that call came, I didn't feel fear. I felt certainty. And I knew something else too. Kevin's last desperate move was about to trigger the public exposure he feared most. And when it happened, there would be no way for him or my parents to control the outcome anymore. At 8:04 p.m., 2 minutes after the bank called, I realized something with absolute clarity. The waiting phase was over. The preparation phase had begun, and every move I made from this point forward had to be precise. Because now, everything was about timing. The man on the phone, Robert Gaines, spoke in a calm, professional tone. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "our records indicate you are listed as a co-liable party on a secured loan associated with the Whitmore family residence." I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react emotionally, because Margaret had prepared me for this moment. "Sir," I replied evenly, "I believe the documentation contains fraudulent information." There was a pause. Not surprise, not disbelief, but attention. "Fraudulent?" he asked carefully. "Yes," I said. "My signature was forged. I never consented to any financial liability." The tone of the conversation shifted instantly, because the word fraud changes everything in financial systems. It triggers internal protocols, legal reviews, risk escalation. Robert's voice became more formal. "Thank you for informing us," he said. "In that case, we will require written documentation from you and may initiate a verification process." "That's fine," I replied calmly. Then I added something very deliberate. "I also have legal representation involved." Another pause. Longer this time, because creditors know what that means. It means the situation isn't simple. It means exposure risk. It means potential litigation. After the call ended, I sat in silence for several seconds. Not because I was afraid, but because I could feel the shift. The moment where this stopped being a private family betrayal and became an official legal matter. The system was now involved. And once financial institutions begin documenting fraud claims, everything becomes traceable, permanent. I called Margaret immediately. She answered on the first ring. "I just spoke with Prairie State Lending," I said. She didn't sound surprised. "I expected that call this week," she replied. "What happens now?" I asked. Her voice remained steady. "Now we prepare," she said, very carefully. The next 2 weeks became the most methodical period of my life. Everything was deliberate, every conversation recorded, every document copied, every timeline documented. Because Margaret explained something critical. In fraud cases, the strength isn't just in proof, she said. It's in organization. The clearer your timeline, the harder it becomes for the other side to deny intent. So we built a complete record. The assault on Christmas Eve, the forged property transfer, the liability clause, the investor presentation, the credit inquiries, the bank call, every event mapped chronologically. Because when patterns are laid out clearly, intent becomes undeniable. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Kevin was unraveling. His messages became increasingly frantic. First, he tried sounding friendly. "Elena, we need to talk like adults." Then, defensive. "You're misunderstanding paperwork." Then angry. "You're going to ruin everything for this family." And finally, desperate. "Please, just call me. We can fix this privately." But I never responded. Not once, because Margaret had warned me about something important. When people realize they've lost control, she said they try to pull you back into emotional conversations. Don't engage. Evidence matters more than words. So I stayed silent. And the silence did exactly what she predicted. It made Kevin panic. 2 weeks later, we received confirmation from Prairie State Lending. Kevin had officially missed 3 consecutive payments. The loan was entering default review, which meant something very specific. The lender would begin verifying all co-liable parties, including me, and that process would expose the forgery internally. That's when Margaret told me something unexpected. "There's going to be a public moment," she said. "What do you mean?" She slid a printed notice across the desk. It was an investor update announcement. Kevin had scheduled a mandatory financial briefing for all stakeholders. Date May 12th. Location the same banquet hall. Purpose addressing restructuring plans. My chest tightened slightly because I immediately understood what this meant. Kevin wasn't just dealing with private lenders anymore. He was facing multiple investors, and he would be forced to explain the financial situation publicly. Margaret looked at me steadily. "This will likely be the moment everything surfaces," she said. "If you choose to act then," I swallowed, because this wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. It was about something deeper. Confrontation, closure, truth revealed in front of everyone who believed his lies. That night, after Lily fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room, thinking about what was coming. Not with anger, not with excitement, but with an unexpected heaviness. Because despite everything, they were still my parents, my brother, people who once held my childhood memories, people who once felt like home, and now they were about to face consequences that could destroy their lives. Let me ask you something. If the moment finally came where you could expose everything, would you hesitate because they were family? Or would you accept that sometimes family must face the truth just like anyone else? Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply allowing reality to catch up. In the weeks leading up to May 12th, Margaret prepared everything meticulously. Legal affidavits, forensic signature analysis, financial timelines, witness documentation from the investor event, even the recorded voicemail Kevin had left. Because when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just be my word. It would be evidence, layered, unavoidable. On the evening of May 11th, the night before the investor briefing, I stood in Lily's doorway, watching her sleep again, just like I had months earlier, and I realized something important. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't afraid, because the outcome no longer depended on confrontation. It depended on facts, and facts don't need to shout. They only need to exist. What I didn't know yet was that during that investor meeting, Kevin would try one last tactic. A desperate attempt to shift blame, to portray himself as the victim. And when he did, he would accidentally reveal something even worse, something that would expose not just fraud, but a betrayal far deeper than financial. And that revelation would change how I saw my parents forever. At exactly 7:03 p.m. on May 12th, my brother Kevin Whitmore walked onto the small stage at the front of the banquet hall and smiled at a room full of investors who had no idea they were about to witness the collapse of everything he had built. I sat in the back row, quiet, invisible, prepared, because this wasn't a confrontation yet. This was the moment where truth would begin revealing itself on its own. And truth, when it surfaces naturally, is far more powerful than accusations. Kevin looked different from the last time I had seen him. His suit was still expensive, his posture still confident, but there were cracks now, tiny ones, visible only if you knew where to look. His smile was too tight. His eyes moved too quickly across the room. His hands gripped the podium just a little too firmly. The body language of a man trying to appear in control, while everything inside him was unraveling. He cleared his throat and began speaking. "As you know," he said smoothly, "our logistics platform has experienced some unexpected market delays." A few investors nodded. Others exchanged quiet looks. Because they had already received partial updates. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. Kevin clicked to the first slide. Revenue projections adjusted downward. Expansion timelines delayed. Funding gaps identified. Standard damage control language. Nothing surprising, nothing alarming. Yet, then came the next slide, and the room's energy shifted. Because the title read, Financial Stability Assurance Plan, Kevin's voice remained steady. Our family-backed collateral structure remains fully intact, he said, and all co-liable parties continue to support our restructuring process. My heart didn't race. It didn't need to, because I knew what was coming next. Kevin looked directly at the audience. And I want to reassure everyone, he continued, that my sister Elena Whitmore, who is a healthcare professional with stable income, remains fully committed to this family guarantee. The words hung in the air, heavy, confident, completely false. And that was the moment Margaret had told me to wait for, because legally, he had just repeated the misrepresentation publicly, on record, in front of witnesses. But Kevin wasn't finished. He took a breath, and then he made a mistake, so reckless, it stunned even me. If there have been recent communication delays, he added casually, it's because Elena has been going through personal instability. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. My chest tightened slightly, because I knew exactly what he was doing. He was preemptively discrediting me, painting me as unreliable. So if the fraud surfaced, he could claim it was a misunderstanding caused by my emotional state. Then he said the words that changed everything. My sister has struggled financially for years, he continued. She's had difficulty managing responsibilities, which is why our parents stepped in to help coordinate family assets on her behalf. A sharp silence fell, because now he wasn't just lying. He was constructing a narrative, one designed to justify why my signature existed on documents, to imply I had agreed, to imply I had needed help. And in that moment, I realized something devastating. My parents weren't just aware of the fraud. They were part of the strategy, because only they could have allowed Kevin to claim they were coordinating assets for me. They hadn't just stood by. They had actively supported the deception. Let me ask you something. If you heard your own brother publicly rewrite your life, turning your struggles into excuses for his fraud, would you interrupt him immediately, or would you wait until he had committed fully to his lies, so the truth could dismantle him completely? Because that moment required restraint, and restraint is the hardest form of strength. Kevin continued speaking for several minutes, describing repayment plans, future investor protections, new revenue strategies. But no one was listening anymore, because the tension in the room had shifted. Investors weren't nodding. They were watching, evaluating, questioning, because something felt off. Even without knowing the truth, people can sense when confidence is forced. Then came the quanda session. A middle-aged man in the second row stood up. My name is David Hargrove, he said calmly. I represent Prairie State Lending. Kevin's face froze for half a second. Barely noticeable, but I saw it, because I had been waiting for it. David continued. Our records show that Miss Elena Whitmore has formally disputed liability for the property-backed loan. The room went completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning hum. You could hear someone shift in their seat. Kevin didn't respond immediately, because for the first time that evening, he hadn't expected the next words. David spoke again. She has provided written notice of suspected identity fraud. The word fraud echoed like a shockwave. Some investors gasped. Others leaned forward sharply. A few immediately opened their phones. Kevin's face drained of color. He tried to recover quickly. This is a misunderstanding, he said. My sister has always been part of, but David interrupted calmly. We have also initiated a verification review of the notarization process. That was the second blow, because it meant Andrew Collins, the notary, was now under scrutiny, too. Kevin's composure cracked visibly. His voice lost its smoothness. This is being handled privately, he said defensively. There's no reason to escalate. But another investor stood up. Are you saying, she asked sharply, that one of the listed guarantors never consented? Kevin opened his mouth, closed it, looked toward the audience, and in that moment, he realized something irreversible. He had lost control of the narrative. Before we continue, think about this. If the truth began surfacing in front of dozens of people, would you step forward immediately? Or would you let the pressure build until the person who betrayed you collapsed under the weight of their own lies? Because the next few minutes would determine everything. Kevin tried one final tactic. He shifted his tone completely, from confident to wounded. "I've sacrificed everything for this family," he said quietly. "I've carried responsibilities no one understands. If mistakes were made, they were made under pressure." There it was, the final stage, victimhood, the last refuge of someone whose lies are unraveling. And that was the exact moment Margaret touched my arm gently. "It's time," she whispered, because Kevin had done exactly what we needed. He had publicly reaffirmed the fraud. He had implicated my parents. He had tried to manipulate the narrative. And now, the truth could no longer remain silent. What I didn't know yet was that when I stood up in the next moment and finally spoke, my father would say something so shocking, so revealing. It would expose a betrayal far deeper than money. A betrayal that had begun years earlier, long before that Christmas Eve. At 7:26 p.m. on May 12th, I stood up from the back row of that banquet hall, and for the first time in years, every member of my family had no choice but to look directly at me. Kevin saw me first. His eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly. For a split second, the confident businessman disappeared, replaced by the same frightened, furious brother who had shoved my head into a dining table months earlier. But this time, he couldn't silence me. Not physically, not emotionally, not legally. The room was so quiet that the sound of my heels against the floor echoed sharply as I walked forward. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because something instinctive happens when truth is about to surface. People sense it. They hold their breath. I didn't rush. I didn't tremble. I didn't look angry. Because anger would have made this emotional. And this wasn't emotional anymore. This was factual, controlled, unavoidable. When I reached the front, Margaret stepped beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her presence alone signaled something important. This was no longer a family disagreement. This was a legal matter. Kevin tried to recover quickly. "Elena," he said, forcing a strained smile. "You didn't need to come here. We could have discussed this privately." I looked at him calmly. "No," I said quietly. "You made it public, so we'll finish it publicly." A ripple moved through the audience, because my tone wasn't emotional. It was steady, final. Kevin's jaw tightened. "You're misunderstanding." I held up a hand slightly, and for the first time in his life, he stopped talking when I told him to. I turned toward the audience. "My name is Elena Grace Whitmore," I said clearly, "and I have never signed any financial liability documents connected to this property or this business." The words landed like a hammer. Clear, direct, undeniable. Margaret stepped forward then. She handed a folder to the representative from Prairie State Lending. Inside were the forensic handwriting analysis report, my sworn affidavit, timeline documentation, proof of identity theft, recorded investor presentation footage, each piece layered carefully, because truth is most powerful when it is structured. The lender flipped through the documents. His expression hardened with each page. Then he nodded slowly and turned toward Kevin. "Mr. Whitmore," he said calmly, "we will be initiating a formal fraud investigation immediately." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Kevin's composure shattered. "This is insane," he snapped. "She's lying. She's always been unstable. She's trying to destroy this family." There it was again. The blame, the deflection, the desperation. I didn't respond immediately, because Margaret had warned me about this stage. Denial always comes first, then blame, then victimhood, then collapse, and Kevin was moving through the stages exactly as predicted. He turned toward the audience, voice rising. "She's been bitter for years," he said. "She couldn't handle her own life choices, so now she wants to ruin mine." I met his gaze calmly. "You didn't ruin yourself by failing," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself by lying. For a moment, he looked stunned, because that was the first direct statement I had ever made to him, without fear, without apology, without hesitation, and the truth in it cut deeper than any accusation. But then, something unexpected happened. My father stood up. Daniel Whitmore had been sitting near the front the entire time, silent, watching. And now, he stepped forward. His voice was cold, controlled, the same tone he had always used when asserting authority. "This has gone far enough," he said sharply. Elena knew exactly what she was signing. The room froze because his statement wasn't defensive. It was absolute. I stared at him, and something inside me shifted, because for a split second, I saw something I had never seen before. Not anger, not pride, but fear. Deep, quiet fear. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I never signed anything." He stepped closer. His voice lowered. And then he said something that changed everything. "You were never supposed to find out," he muttered. The words hit like a physical blow, because they weren't denial. They were admission, a slip of truth spoken in frustration. Before I could respond, he continued. "We only did what was necessary," he said sharply. "You left this family. You made irresponsible choices. We had to protect the future." My chest tightened. "Protect it from me?" I asked quietly. His jaw clenched. "From instability," he replied. And then he said the words that shattered whatever illusion still remained. "You were never meant to inherit anything anyway," he said. "You weren't even supposed to be listed on the original trust." The room fell completely silent, because now, this wasn't just about financial fraud. It was about something deeper, something older, something that had shaped my entire life. Without my knowledge, I stared at him, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to realize what he had revealed. But it was too late, because once truth begins surfacing, it can't be forced back down. He looked away, but his next words came out anyway. Cold, sharp, final. "You were only added because your mother insisted," he said. "You were never part of the original plan. Let me ask you something. If you discovered that your exclusion wasn't just recent, but had been planned for years, would it hurt more than the fraud itself? Or would it finally explain everything you had felt your entire life?" Because in that moment, something inside me became painfully clear. This betrayal hadn't started with money. It hadn't started with the house. It hadn't even started with Kevin. It had started long before that, long before Christmas Eve, long before I left home. And as I stood there, looking at my father's face, I realized there was one more truth hidden beneath everything, a truth he hadn't meant to reveal, but one he was about to expose completely. Because in the next few seconds, he would say something that would change how I saw my family forever, something that would explain why I had never truly belonged in that house at all. At 7:41 p.m. inside that silent banquet hall, I realized something was about to be revealed that had nothing to do with loans, fraud, or money. Because my father's face had changed, not into anger, not into authority, but into something I had never seen in him before. A man who had just said too much, and now didn't know how to stop. The air felt heavy. No one moved. No one whispered. Because even the investors, strangers to our family, could sense that what was unfolding had shifted beyond a financial dispute. This was something deeper, personal, foundational. I kept my voice steady. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. "I wasn't part of the original plan." My father didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened. His eyes flickered briefly toward my mother. Patricia Whitmore was sitting rigidly in her chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white. Her eyes didn't meet mine, and that silence told me more than any words could. Kevin stepped forward quickly. "Dad, don't," he said sharply. But my father ignored him. Because once someone begins losing control of a narrative they've maintained for decades, they often do something dangerous. They keep talking. "You left," my father said coldly. "As soon as you turned 19, you made it clear you didn't want this family." I shook my head slowly. That's not what I asked. The room felt smaller, tighter, like everyone was leaning toward something inevitable. Then my father exhaled sharply and said the words that shattered everything. "You were never meant to stay," he said. For a moment, I didn't understand. The sentence felt incomplete, like it carried meaning beneath the surface. "What does that mean?" I asked. His voice dropped lower, harder. "It means he said that this family was never structured around you." The words struck like ice, because suddenly, memories began rearranging themselves in my mind. The constant comparisons to Kevin, the coldness, the lack of protection, the way my mother always treated me as an obligation rather than a daughter. And then, my father said the truth he had kept buried for decades. "You were never supposed to be our responsibility," he said flatly. The room seemed to tilt, because in that instant, everything I had always felt but could never explain suddenly had a shape, a meaning, a source. I whispered, "What are you saying?" He looked directly at me and finally said it clearly. "You were your mother's decision," he said. "Not mine." A low murmur rippled through the audience, but I barely heard it because the words were still echoing inside my head. "Not mine, not mine, not mine." My mother's breathing became audible, shallow, unsteady, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled for the first time in my life. "Daniel, stop," she whispered. But he didn't, because the truth, once released, cannot be contained. "You want to know why you were never treated like Kevin," he continued. "Because Kevin is my son." Silence fell like a physical weight. "And you," he said, "you were never supposed to carry this family name." My heart stopped, just for a moment, because I finally understood. This wasn't favoritism. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't personality differences. It was something much colder, much older, much more permanent. Let me ask you something. If you discovered that the emotional distance you felt your entire life wasn't imagined, but rooted in a truth hidden from you since childhood, would it destroy you? Or would it finally set you free? Because that moment could have broken me. Years earlier, it would have. But not now. Not after everything I had endured. My voice came out calm, almost quiet. "So all of this I said, the exclusion, the forgery, the lies, you justified it because you never saw me as your responsibility." My father didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. The simplicity of his answer was more devastating than anything else he could have said. No apology, no hesitation, no remorse, just confirmation. My mother finally stood up. Tears streamed down her face. "Elena," she said, "I wanted to tell you years ago, but I held up my hand." And she stopped, because in that moment, I wasn't a hurt child. I was an adult who finally understood. And understanding removes the power of secrets. I looked at her calmly. "You didn't protect me," I said. "You protected your silence." Her shoulders shook, but she didn't deny it. Kevin tried to step forward again. "This has nothing to do with the business," he snapped. "This is private family history." I turned toward him slowly. "No," I said. "It has everything to do with it." Because now, the entire pattern was undeniable. They didn't just exclude me from inheritance. They felt entitled to use me, exploit me, erase me, because in their minds, I wasn't fully theirs to begin with. And in that moment, a strange calm settled over me. Not sadness, not anger, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a lifelong question finally receives an answer. Before we go further, think about this. If you learn that the people who hurt you never truly saw you as belonging to them, would it feel like rejection? Or would it finally release you from the need for their approval? Because for the first time in my life, I realized something powerful. I had spent decades trying to earn love from people who never intended to give it. And now, I didn't need it anymore. I turned back towards the investors, toward the lender, toward the room full of witnesses, and spoke calmly. This is why they believed they could use my identity. I said, because they never saw me as someone they needed to protect. Margaret placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, a silent signal. The legal process would move forward now. Fraud investigations, civil claims, potential criminal charges. everything inevitable, everything irreversible. My father sat down heavily. For the first time, he looked old, not powerful, not controlled, just diminished. Because the truth he had hidden for decades had not protected him. It had exposed him. What I didn't expect was how quiet I felt inside. No storm, no collapse, just stillness, like a long, exhausting tension had finally ended. Because the deepest betrayal was no longer hidden, and once the deepest truth is revealed, everything else loses its power. What remained now was the final step, not revenge, not confrontation, but something far more important, closure, and a boundary that could never be crossed again. At 6:12 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning, 3 months later, I sat on the small, wooden porch of a townhouse that officially belonged to me, watching my daughter Lily water a row of bright yellow marigolds she had planted herself. The air smelled like fresh soil in summer. Birds moved between power lines. The world felt calm, ordinary, peaceful. And for the first time in my life, peace didn't feel temporary. It felt permanent. The legal process had moved exactly as Margaret predicted. Once Prairie State Lending completed its internal review, everything escalated quickly. The forensic analysis confirmed the forgery. The notary, Andrew Collins, admitted under investigation that he had notarized documents without witnessing my signature. Investors filed civil claims. Fraud charges were referred to the county prosecutor, and the property transfer was legally reversed. Kevin's business collapsed within weeks. Investors withdrew. Loans defaulted. Civil liability cases piled up, and eventually he filed for personal bankruptcy protection. But bankruptcy doesn't erase fraud. It only freezes the damage. The consequences remained. Permanent. My father, Daniel Whitmore, faced something different. Not prison, but something he valued more than freedom. Reputation. His name appeared in court filings. Local business circles learned what had happened. Neighbors whispered. Old colleagues distanced themselves. Because in communities like ours, financial betrayal carries a stain that never fully disappears. My mother tried to contact me many times. Letters, emails, voicemails filled with apologies and explanations. But I didn't respond, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because some boundaries once set must remain firm. Let me ask you something. If someone hurts you deeply, do they deserve endless access to you just because they share your blood? Or is true healing sometimes about distance? Because for years, I believed forgiveness meant reconnection. Now, I understood something different. Forgiveness is internal. Boundaries are external, and both can exist at the same time. The townhouse closing happened on July 3rd at 2:15 p.m. I remember signing the final documents carefully. Each stroke of the pen felt symbolic, because this time, every signature was mine, voluntary, verified, protected. When the escrow officer handed me the keys, she smiled. "Congratulations, Miss Whitmore." The words felt simple, but they carried years of struggle, years of survival, years of rebuilding without support. Lily ran through the empty living room that afternoon, her laughter echoing against the walls. "This is really ours?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Ours." She hugged me tightly, and in that moment, I realized something profound. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by safety, by protection, by who shows up when it matters. And Lily and I, we were already a complete family. One evening, a few weeks after moving in, I sat with Margaret at a small cafe downtown. We weren't discussing legal strategy anymore. We were simply talking about life, about resilience, about what comes after survival. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "most people think revenge is about hurting the other person." I looked at her. "What is it really about?" She smiled slightly. "Taking back control of your life." That sentence stayed with me. Because it was true. I hadn't destroyed my family. Their choices had done that. All I had done was refuse to carry their lies any longer. There was one final moment I never expected. A month later, a small envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside, was a single photograph, an old one, from when I was about 6 years old. I was standing in the Whitmore backyard, holding a small yellow flower, smiling, carefree. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 3 words. "I'm sorry, Elena." I held the photo for a long time. Not crying, not angry, just quiet. Because that apology, late as it was, no longer had power over me. I didn't need it to heal. I had already done that myself. Before we end, I want to ask you something. If you finally reached a place where the people who hurt you no longer controlled your emotions, would that feel like victory or simply peace? Because for me, it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about freedom. On that quiet Sunday morning, Lily came running toward me on the porch. "Mommy," she said excitedly. "Look, the flowers are growing." I smiled and looked at the bright yellow petals swaying gently in the sunlight. "Yes," I said softly. "They are." And in that moment, I understood something deeply. Karma isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't celebrate. It simply restores balance, slowly, quietly, inevitably. If you've ever experienced betrayal, family drama, or the pain of being excluded, remember this: you don't need revenge to heal. You need clarity, boundaries, and the courage to build a life they can never touch. And if this story stayed with you, if you believe that truth always finds its way to the surface, then stay with this channel, because there are more stories like this coming. Stories about justice, about resilience, about the moment when the tables finally turn. And sometimes, the most powerful ending is simply a peaceful beginning.